This Olympic stadium cost $109 million to build just to be demolished after the Olympics ended. It was only used 5 times. The Olympics, nothing quite compares to how exciting it is to watch the games. And for countries, hosting is a great honor with no expense spared. Host nations will spend millions and billions of dollars preparing their cities. But when the flame is extinguished, what happens to all those new stadiums, monuments, the Olympic Village, and well, honestly, everything? The sad reality is that majority of host cities mismanage their Olympic-sized investments, leaving most of these magnificent structures to rot. Granted, some venues like Sydney Olympic Park remain a vibrant hub almost 25 years later, but shouldn't this be the case for all Olympic cities? Today we are going to be talking about these leftover venues and what happens. Also, what will happen to Paris? The 2016 Rio Games cost $13.1 billion, the Beijing Games totaled $40 billion, and Sochi 2014 took gold, with their budget soaring over $51 billion. A 2016 study found that the modern Olympic Games have consistently overshot their budgets by 156% since 1960. The Olympics are huge. The primary focus besides sports is to deliver a spectacle. Nations spend billions to potentially make billions back. Does it work? Short answer is kinda. The model has worked incredibly well in the past, but today it's not as effective. Some cities bidding to host future games like Hamburg, Budapest, and Rome even recognized this trend and withdrew their future bids from the International Olympic Committee, also known as the IOC. History has shown hesitation by other cities, specifically after the 1976 Montreal Games. The original budget for the Montreal Olympics was an optimistic $89.5 million USD. The total cost escalated to approximately $1.15 billion. After this disaster, the IOC adjusted their model, requiring future hosts to set up financial contingencies against revenue shortfalls. In case you're wondering, it took Montreal until 2006 to pay off the last of its Olympic debt, roughly 30 years after the Games. So after the 1976 Games, many cities like Denver refused to host, and the IOC panicked a little bit. They needed to change this narrative. Then LA happened. Everything changed after the Los Angeles Olympics held in 1984. They demonstrated an extremely profitable model, generating a surplus of $232.5 million USD. LA used existing venues, minimizing initial costs while also negotiating a groundbreaking $225 million television deal with ABC. Due to LA's success, there was a surge of cities bidding to host with the IOC. The biggest takeaway from this short history lesson is that the IOC became even more selective, choosing cities with ambitious plans. The IOC wants that spectacle and glamour. Their bidding process that candidate nations go through to become a host city is rather costly. To better illustrate this, Tokyo invested approximately $150 million in an unsuccessful bid for the 2016 Olympics. So overall, we have learned that hosting the Olympics cost a lot without a guaranteed return. Take the 2008 Beijing and 2021 Tokyo Games, for instance. Their expense vastly outstripped the generated revenues of $3.6 billion and $5.8 billion, respectively. Now that you know the context, let's take a look at some venues. All of these countries on the list struggled finding ways to practically use the oversized facilities or the Olympic Village after the Olympics concluded. I found that the aftermath for the following venues typically culminated into one of 3 scenarios. 1, they were totally abandoned. 2, they were demolished pretty quickly. Or 3, the financial burden of ongoing maintenance is crippling. South Korea built a $109 million Olympic stadium that held its opening ceremony just to tear it down. The entire design philosophy behind it was temporality, so a lot of the elements like heating and even a roof were never included in the design. The 35,000-seat stadium was shortly demolished after the closing ceremony on February 25, 2018. South Korea spent about $13 billion preparing and staging the Winter Olympics. Today, most of the venues like the speed skating arena, hockey center, the bobsled track, and more remain abandoned. I suppose you never really think about what happens to the ski slopes. Rare trees were plucked out of this province's mountainside to make way for this now underutilized course. You can't help but think that all of that was lost just for a few weeks of heightened tourism. The host province has also failed to garner national financial support to pay for the estimated $5.3 million annual maintenance cost for the remaining venues. Most of Rio's Olympic Village turned into a ghost town only a few months after the Olympics concluded. The Maracana Stadium, which was originally built for the 1950 World Cup and held 198,000 fans, had its power cut because nobody was paying the bills. Granted, this was an expensive $500 million renovated structure for the games, but it still descended into disorder. And unfortunately, none of this invested money fulfilled Rio's promise for clearing up its favelas, which have been quoted to have free-flowing sewage on the streets. Instead, they opted to construct this Olympic golf course, which took 3 years to build and replaced a national wildlife reserve. Today, that golf course remains empty, and most venues experience episodes of robbery and vandalism. This Olympic complex was built on Athens' old airport grounds for the Games in 2004. Initial plans hoped to turn the complex into the largest metropolitan park in Europe, but today the complex remains abandoned. Athens saw its Olympic cost balloon to 15 billion USD, doubling the initial budget. And even today, Greece grapples with destabilizing effects of the European economic crisis. But also keep in mind, Athens constructed a brand new airport and subway system in preparation for the Games. Many locals remain grateful for the Games because of these modern infrastructural developments. Just a year after the 1996 Games, the Atlanta Fulton Stadium was demolished to create 4,000 new parking spaces. Atlanta, Georgia spent $1.7 billion preparing for the Games and generated substantial returns. However, many of its constructed venues like Stone Mountain Tennis Center and the Herdon Stadium remain abandoned and tagged. Georgia Dome was an anomaly, remaining in use for 2 decades before being replaced by the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And it was really only replaced because they wanted to modernize it. Sochi was the most expensive Olympics to date, despite having fewer events than Summer Games and fewer athletes. Russia wanted to transition Sochi into the winter tourist hub. Russian photographer Alexandra Belenky reported that the resort was virtually empty, with the region operating at 5% capacity shortly after the Games concluded. The 2014 Winter Games were hosted inside Sochi National Park and was encompassed by a UNESCO World Heritage Area. The region had virtually no stadiums, ski hills, or infrastructure to accommodate 100,000 people. More than 3,000 hectare acres of rare regional forest were carelessly logged to build the majority of these venues from scratch. Now, this stadium cost approximately $780 million and was intended just for the opening and closing ceremonies. It's still standing though and is costly to maintain. There's no real practical use. London's a very interesting example, as a lot of their venues were designed initially to be adaptable. Most are still in use today. The 624 million USD Olympic Stadium underwent a $386 million taxpayer-funded renovation, converting it into London Stadium. It is a very well-used, well-loved venue. Along with the box arena, the basketball arena was the largest temporary venue to be used for these Olympic Games. A cool consideration, though, was that the white facade that was wrapped around this steel frame was recyclable PVC, which can be reused as either its raw material or in other temporary arenas. Prior to the 2012 Olympics, a lot of inspiring housing literature was circulated. More than 9,000 affordable homes were to be built on the former Olympic Park, but only 1,200 homes were built on site, and majority remain unaffordable. Locals have rallied against these developments, but not much has been done, as, quote, schemes must be viable for developers that wanted to maximize both affordable housing and returns from the site. For the 2008 Games, residents were rehoused while buildings were bulldozed to support the widespread infrastructure developments, costing approximately 3.6 billion USD. Post-games, most venues have failed to find long-term use. Granted, some venues have become a tourist attraction, like the Bird's Nest Stadium or the Water Cube, but the majority of the venues are relics, including the Whitewater Kayaking Stadium, BMX track, the beach volleyball arena. We should also mention the mascots, which now live abandoned behind this never completed mall. Beijing reported spending $6.8 billion hosting. This amount, though, excludes the tens of billions of dollars spent on infrastructure projects, including roads, stadium subway lines, and a new airport terminal. Now, what about Paris? Paris Olympics have made a commitment to sustainability, reporting that 95% of venues are existing or temporary structures, including using Versailles for the equestrian events. How neat. The Parisian Olympic Village also seems to be pretty planned out, with the exception of dining. Residential blocks lack traditional air conditioning systems, and some countries brought their own units, actually. After the Olympics, these blocks will transform into student housing for nearly 6,000 individuals. Post-games, materials and structures that were installed on a temporary basis will be repurposed or recycled. So I'm excited to see how that will play out. Paris also built a timber aquatic center and will be the only major facility built for the 2024 Olympic Games. Costing around 200 million USD, the center extensively uses about 81,000 square feet of wood, which is a greener alternative to steel and concrete. There's an 80-meter spanned roof that is very unique. It's not only aesthetically mimicking the athlete's diving form, the curved roof is also very functional indoors, as the raised sides accommodate the stands while dipping in the middle to reduce the volume of space, making it more efficient to heat. But overall, for Paris to not build extensively is still inherently greener than previous Olympics. There's often a rush to prepare for the games that overshadows sustainable planning and design and construction phases. There's been more concern about displaced communities and questionable labor practices, along with the general economic burden of hosting the Olympics. I'd like to believe that Paris tried really hard to establish a greener legacy for the Games. And that, my friends, is better than gold. If you liked this video, please be sure to check out my video on why we don't build beautiful buildings anymore.